Because I consider this topic so critical for all photographers who capture images and save them to their disks as raw files. What you do in your in-camera settings makes all the difference in the world in whether you will get a well-exposed image. I have included in the materials for this week a PDF file that says raw capture and JPEG camera settings, and it's a PDF. I'm going to mention a few things in this and then encourage you to carefully read this entire article. I've given you links to go back out and to see the original sources, but the important part, I think, for most of us is to understand that although you will receive raw data when you download the image from your memory card, you're making a decision on how well exposed your image is by looking at a histogram while you're taking the photo. And the important thing to understand is that histogram you see is made from a JPEG capture of the scene. The camera does not have any image from the raw data. It doesn't have any pixels. And so in your camera, you have style settings for JPEGs. And you know, if you just never saved JPEGs normally, you may have ignored the style settings. They are very important because they determine what information your histogram will give you. So if you have one which is set for the average person who takes JPEGs, it will probably have contrast heightened, saturation done a bit. It will do things to make that finished image look as finished as a JPEG as possible. And when it creates the histogram after you push that shutter, it's based on the JPEG settings. So think for a minute. If you have a typical JPEG style that has increased the contrast and added some saturation, what you're getting is a histogram that does not match the raw data that's captured. And so for many years, I went to that histogram and I looked at it and I worked at it till I felt that the image was stretched out and using the full width of the histogram, and I thought I was doing fine. And then lo and behold, when I was alerted to this problem, I went and noticed that it was reflecting the JPEG which had added contrast. Well, what contrast does is it raises the white point and it brings down the dark point to give more contrast. And it makes you think that you've done a great job of exposing. You filled the histogram, when in fact the raw data does not reflect that information. And when I was told to check for this, and this came out of an NFRCC convention that Stephen Johnson spoke at years ago. And when I went and looked at my image when it was opened, the raw file was opened in Camera Raw, lo and behold, what I found there was that I was underexposed. And I thought, how can it be underexposed? I checked my histogram. But of course, my histogram was reflecting a JPEG style that had increased the contrast and increased the saturation. So the trick was for me to go back in my camera to the JPEG styles and get the most neutral one I could get. In fact, Stephen Johnson said to me, if you look at the settings for that neutral standard JPEG, you may find that it has some contrast added. He said, if you can do that, lower it back down so that the image you get on the back of your camera will not look like a finished, beautiful shot, but the histogram that you get when you look at that will carefully give you an indication of how well exposed that image is. And so if you have not done this, you might have encountered the fact that what you thought you did when you exposed it and then what you got in histogram when you opened your raw file didn't match very well. And this would be the explanation. If this hasn't been a problem, it's possible that your JPEGs are standard and that you don't have them souped up. But if out of the factory, they tend to come with this extra quality because the person who picks up your camera and puts it on JPEG wants finished images. And you want quality data so you can finish the image later. So when you get to the article that you see on the screen here, you'll notice he talks first about exposing to the right. And we know that means that the brightest part of your image has more data than the dark shadows. We also know that the dark shadows are where the noise lurks. So you want to be sure you haven't wasted the right side of that exposure. And as you can remember, I just said, I was ignoring the right size because I thought the JPEG histogram had told me I did a good job when I hadn't. So exposing to the right reminds us that most of the data in an image file comes from the brighter part. Well, that makes sense because the signal coming into your sensor is much greater if there is light coming in. And where there's very little light, you have a very low signal. And when that signal ratio is low, you get lots of noise. And then he talks about clipping highlights and warning you that you want a fully exposed image, but you want an accurate reading that doesn't have you overexposed. So it's important that that histogram you're looking at is giving you the information that will be found in the raw file later when you open it. And so it goes through lots of good things and tells you how to take care of them and what you have to do with your camera. I think it's an excellent article, and I have two places where Charles Glatzer's original articles can be found, and you're certainly welcome to go to them. And I comment at the end that I thank Stephen Johnson every time I get a well-exposed image for having clued me into this many years ago when he presented to the NFRCC convention. So this doesn't have much to see, but it allows me to speak to you and tell you, please pay attention to the article that I've called Raw Capture and JPEG Camera Settings, and it's the one that is seen on the screen.